I'm Jim Collison, live from Omaha, Nebraska, in the Gallup offices in Sydney, Australia. This is Gallup's Call to Coach, recorded on October 18th, 2016. Call to Coach is a resource for those who want to help others discover and use their strengths. We have Gallup experts and independent strengths coaches share tactics, insights, and strategies to help coaches maximize the talent of individuals, teams, and organizations around the world. If you have questions during this webcast, we do have a live chat room available for you. It's right below the main video window. If you just look down on our live page there, best way to get your comments in is to hit the login button, bottom left-hand corner. Choose the guest account, put your name in where it says guest, and then hit submit, and that'll put you right into our chat room. We'll be taking your questions live during the program. If you're listening to the recorded version, I have questions about custom strengths coaching solutions for small, medium, or large organizations. We do that too. You can send us an email, coaching@gallup.com, or use the contact form right there on the live page. Don't forget to visit the Gallup Strengths Center, just gallupstrengthscenter.com. For all your coaching resources and Strengths Finder training needs, you can also catch the video, both streaming and downloadable audio for offline listening to past programs. We do have some 150 plus past programs if you wanted to get out there. Lots of hours of professional development for you. They're all listed, including the links to our mobile apps where you can get your top 5 at your fingertips, all available on our coaches blog. Just head out to coaching.gallup.com. Ann Lingenfelter is our host today. She works as a learning solutions consultant with Gallup in our Sydney office. Ann, always great to see you. And today, I kind of wish, with spring coming on in Australia, I wish I was there to see it with you. Fall here, and it's getting colder in Nebraska. Welcome to Call the Coach.
Yes, thanks, Jim. Always nice to be here. It is. It's actually already feeling like summer here. I am very happy to say I'm coming to Nebraska in February, and I'm really excited. I don't care if it's going to be, under 5 feet of snow. I'm
Why?
happy to say. No, just the draw of Gallup, the home office there, and meeting all of you guys face to face. I can't wait. Despite the snow, I'm looking forward to it.
It'll be great. It'll be great to have you here.
Yeah, thanks. Looking forward to it. Look, Jim, our guest today is Dion Rademeyer, and for those who are in our coaching community, he is no stranger. Dion is one of our Gallup-certified coaches based here in Sydney. He is someone who has been a very generous contributor to our Call to Coach page on Facebook. So he is someone who has been very generous about sharing resources he's developed. I think that our Gallup certified coaching community look at him as a leader, frankly, in the community. And so it's always great to be able to have a chance to talk to him and hear about, what's going on with him and his business. Dion spent 25 years in banking, finance, and technology areas in both South Africa and Australia, mainly in the field of project management. He set up a consulting company a couple of years ago, I believe, Dion, I'll have to clarify that, called Team Diagnostics, and he focuses on helping large, complex project teams set up for success using Q12 and strengths. So he knows more about Q12 than a lot of folks, so that'll be interesting to talk about as well. And he works across borders, so certainly in Australia and India, other countries as well. So Dion, welcome to Call to Coach. I should also say that you've been here in Sydney. We've been able to call you ours for 16 years or so since you moved from South Africa. You're married and you have 2 daughters who are 16 and 20. But welcome to the show, and thanks for being here.
Well, thank you very much, Anne. It's absolutely awesome to be back, and look forward to spending the next hour with you.
So, Dion, when we were talking prior to the show, you were one of the guys who was lucky enough to go to Omaha for the summit, and I'll be interested to hear what the experience was like for you. Let's just start there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. I was actually in 2 minds as to whether or not I should actually, go over to the summit. One of the main reasons being, of course, there's the cost element. There's the lost earning opportunity, when you're not actually doing your primary work. And it actually took me a while to think about it. But eventually I decided, this is an investment in myself. I want to be able to connect with, like-minded coaches from around the world, and also to meet a lot of the Gallup team who've actually created a lot of the artifacts that we are using. So I thought, I'll go. And boy, was I glad that I actually booked in, because it was just, it had so many plus factors, so many benefits. One of the main ones for myself was that it reconfirms for me that this is what I want to do, and that this is something that I am on the right track, which was great. So just to show you just how much of an impact that's had, as soon as the link came out to book for next year, I booked and paid, literally as that email arrived. So the summit was great, and I'm certainly going back as soon as I possibly can.
Fantastic. I should ask for your top 5 because our listeners are going to want to know that. So let me have you put that out there first.
Sure, absolutely. So responsibility, connectedness, relator, maximizer, and developer.
So what, 3 relationship building themes in the top 5?
That's correct, absolutely. And it's interesting that even the maximizer for me is actually more, how do I maximize people as opposed to maximize process, as opposed to our execution friends who have maximizer with a whole lot of execution. I love to call on them to get stuff done. But for me, it's always been about how do I use my talents to maximize teams and individuals.
And I know one of the reasons you wanted to come on today was to be able to talk about sort of a shift or a new direction that you see in your work as a Gallup-Certified Strengths Coach coming out of the summit, and how that you sort of came to a point of clarity about what the next step is going to look like for you. So I definitely want to explore that, and certainly we will today. But before we do that, can you give us a bit of a snapshot about what the last 2 years has been like for you as a certified coach? I mean, what can you kind of just walk us through a little bit of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So as Anne mentioned, I'd spent the best part of my career working in banks and finance companies, mainly in the area of project management and in the technology space. But the one thing for me that always stood out was I was more of a people-focused technologist as opposed to a pure techo. And that for me was one of the things that I would always be drawn back to. How can I help the individuals? How can I help people? And for me, it was a few years ago, I had that watershed moment in my life where I was leading a large project team, and got to the point where I said, I need to do something different. I need to do something that actually ignites the passion and the fire within me in terms of, why I'm here and what am I going to do in what I call career 2.0. So the first half of my career has been the professional development. The second half of my career, what's that going to look like, and where is it going to actually leave meaning? So when it comes to, we think of our legacy, it'll be great if, on my tombstone one day they say, here lies Dion, strengths advocate, as opposed to, project manager. So I think that for me would be a really, really great, a great, headline to go out with. But, we have to do something meaningful. So I resigned from the bank where I was working, one of the largest banks in Australia. I resigned from the bank, and I decided to actually go out and focus on becoming a strengths coach. So that was a big shift. Went through the second program here in Sydney, and then was fully armed with my 2 suitcases full of Gallup materials, and I was now going to go and conquer Sydney. The interesting thing in terms of I suppose my own journey was that I could see the application of strengths in so many areas, and the value that could be derived from that. So whether it was my kids using it who were school-aged, using it in sporting teams, whether it be faith-based organizations, wherever there were groups of people, I was trying to think about, how can I actually spread this word as far and as wide, because how can people not love it? And so for me, it was around actually, I suppose, it was like eating an orange, and just every time you peel another segment, there's another little bit, so we'll do something for, men's groups and something for women's groups. We can do something for our sporting teams and so on, and corporate teams, and then one-on-one coaching. And it was interesting that I had a number of individual clients, not a lot. My focus was mainly in corporate teams, so focusing on what I had been familiar with from a professional perspective. But I'd seen so much value in my family. For the first time in 20-odd years, I actually understood my wife. And for me, that was actually a real watershed and a real eye-opener as well, because for 20 years, your partner does things in a certain way, and certain things you appreciate and certain things you tolerate. And those items that I was tolerating all of a sudden became so blatantly clear. She did her strengths, and all of a sudden it was that aha moment as a family, because we would sit around the dinner table and actually all take out our strengths reports, read through them, and just burst out laughing, because it's like, but of course you're that way. It explains you exactly. Now, for myself, my wife is her top five. In her top five, she has achiever, focus, maximizer, and belief. And she doesn't have adaptability. Sorry, one of those eco-friendly lines. Adaptability for her is right down at the bottom. So I was getting frustrated that she couldn't do more than one thing at a time. But when you think of it in terms of achiever, and she needs to reset that clock every day, when you couple that with focus and with maximizer and with belief, it's no wonder that she was focused on one thing at a time. And she was going to do that to the best of her ability. And don't say, I'm busy doing A, and, oh, by the way, where's dinner? And have you picked up the kids? For her, it was very much around, she always picked up the kids, I must say. That was the only bit that she was able to sort of juggle with. But what it did was it actually replaced irritation, got replaced with curiosity. And for me, that was actually one of those, tremendous, tremendous aha moments where this body of material that I was using in a corporate setting could actually have as much practical application in my personal life and in my family. So that was just a tremendous story there. And then, of course, our daughters, we got them to do strengths. My eldest daughter, who's now second year law, she then did her strengths, and she's actually started using her top five every time she has to frame an application, every time she has to apply for something at university. Because invariably the questions are, what are your strengths? What do you bring to the party? What value can you add to this particular scenario? And every time she's framed it with her top five by just simply saying, my Gallup top five are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then she actually answers the question and the value she can bring in the context of her top five. And that has just been, for her, she's actually had great success as well in terms of actually being successful in the things that she's applied for. And our youngest daughter, she has actually made it her own in terms of when she turned 15 last year, and then we got her to do her full strengths. What she then did was she would come home from school and say, today I used this strength on the playground. Now, when you can take a 15-year-old who can actually intentionally identify and decide before the day starts which of their talents they're going to use, that's a tremendous, tremendous asset that you can have. So her self-awareness has gone from, a typical 15-year-old teenager, their limited self-awareness, to suddenly being so in tune and knowing how to actually apply that. So that just on a personal level, I thought I'd just maybe start off with that and just say that's really what I've seen in the past 2 years, just as a family. How we now start to intentionally use strengths, and it's now part of our everyday language.
I like how you paint. Sorry for interrupting you. I love that visual that you've just given us of sort of an orange. You peel the orange, and you have all these segments, and each segment is like a different sector or a different area in our world where strengths can be applied. I love that, and my question is, I guess when you first start, as you have that image of you walking out of the Gallup office with your 2 suitcases full of resources, how do you know which bit of the segment should be yours? Which is your niche, where you should focus? How do you manage that when you see all of that out there for the taking? How have you been able to sort of, focus in on which one really is calling your name?
That's a great question. And, it's actually interesting that because I was so excited, I wanted the whole orange. So I wanted to just conquer everything. I wanted, I'm going to take strengths to every corner of the globe. Every team needs strengths. Every person needs strengths. And it actually took going to the summit for me to actually really start to think about, what my niche is going to be. There were a number of speakers and sessions speaking about, what's your niche? And one of the stories that I have from the summit was, as I connected with a lot of coaches from around the globe, invariably I'd ask them, what's your focus? Just trying to understand, am I doing something similar or different to other people? And so many of the coaches that I spoke to said their focus is corporate teams. And the next person, what's your focus? No, corporate teams. And yours, no, corporate teams. And that was, whether it was in Washington or San Francisco, everybody seemed to be focusing on a very similar aspect, certainly the people I was speaking to. And I then started thinking, well, what's my focus? And I thought, well, actually my focus is corporate teams. And it took, and so I started just thinking about that. And on the flight back, one of our Gallup colleagues, Claire de Carteret, flew back with me, and she asked me a simple question. And she simply said, Dion, what space do you want to own in terms of strengths? And it was such a profound question that really got me thinking, seeing that I had a 16.5-hour flight ahead of me with nowhere to go. I had Soar With Your Strengths that we got at the conference, and so I read that on the way back, and I started pondering about, what is my niche going to be, and what space am I going to own? Seeing that it seemed to be fairly congested, it looked like everybody was focusing on the same thing I was focusing on. So when I got back from the summit, I caught up with a fellow coach friend of mine, and talking to him about the summit, and he's then shared with me this concept of the red ocean and the blue ocean. And he said to me, in the red ocean, that's where everybody's fighting for the same piece of food. So you can imagine an ocean full of food and full of sharks and full of people, and everyone's fishing in the same pond, and there's a lot of activity. And then he said, contrast that with the blue ocean, where you're the only person in the ocean, and you own the ocean, and you've got just you and your sailing boat, and you're fishing, and there's no competition. The fish are biting, and it's just you. And as I started to then reflect around, well, what's my blue ocean experience going to be? What niche am I going to go after? And that got me to really start to think, well, how do I leverage the experience that I've built over the past 25 years? Because I don't want to throw away everything that I've done, but how do I leverage that, and how do I then apply strengths in terms of my professional life? And that then led me to start thinking about, well, where do I add value? What do I enjoy doing? And for me, it then became fairly clear to start off with, which was around, well, I'm a project professional. So what if I use strengths more in a project context? And then I started thinking, well, which projects could benefit the most for it? And the ones that came to mind were always those larger projects where you typically have many different participants, either from your own internal company as well as your external partners, whether they be some of the large technology companies, whether you've outsourced work to a lower cost environment like India or the Philippines. How do we then actually create a project team that is set up for success using the knowledge that I've had and that I've gained through Gallup? And that then led me to then say, well, I'm going to define this new direction, this new niche of mine as how do I help large project teams that are complex, that are geographically dispersed, how are we going to help those set up for success? So all of a sudden, I've taken strengths and the strengths intervention for myself away from being a discretionary piece of work that you need to do, something which some people might think of it as a team build, and reshaping that into, this is actually an absolute mandatory piece. This is your insurance in terms of your project being successful, or one of the elements. And typically in most projects, you'll have the three basic concepts around having people, processes, and technologies, in particular the technology project, people, process, and technology. We focus so much time on methodologies, and much of our time is spent on the process side. We have steering committees, and we have daily stand-ups if you're using Agile. We have a lot of technology, and we spend lots of time and effort there. But then I realized that actually 80% of our cost is actually wrapped up in the people. And the type of projects that we do in the financial services are not capital intensive, as in buildings and machinery, but they're actually human capital intensive. And yet we're spending almost zero effort and time in making sure that our project teams are actually well aligned and well oiled. So that then actually got me to say, well, all right, so now I've defined it's going to be large project teams. How am I going to help them be set up for success? And I then reshaped that into, there'll be two types of projects where I think and intervention could be required. Bear in mind, these are projects that are probably at a minimum spend of about $10 million and probably around 50 people involved, and anything upwards from there. The first one that came to mind was, well, if we're setting up a brand new project and we're going to be pulling all sorts of people together who haven't worked together in the past, then that would be an obvious candidate for this new service offering. And the first thing that we'll do is we'll actually do a baseline. We'll use Q12, which obviously is one of Gallup's products, which I've been using quite a lot lately. And this really helps us to establish, where is the team at? How engaged are these people who call themselves a team, who've come from very, very different backgrounds or different companies? But then once we know how engaged they are, we then have our Set Up for Success workshop. And this is where, as we kick the project off, we do the inception planning, we do all of the work breakdowns, but now we introduce the third element, which is around the people. Now we're going to understand everybody's strengths. And regardless of whether people are in India or in Australia, the strengths are so easy to administer. You just send them the code, they do it, and you can then put together your grids, and you can actually have some meaningful conversation, meaningful data that you can use. And then you partner throughout the life of the project. These projects typically run for anything from 6 to 12 months plus. So on a monthly basis, having ongoing coaching calls with the project managers and the team leads to make sure that they don't forget about the people. Making it visible on the visual management boards. This is about, actually, this is not a once-off event anymore. This is not about let's go and have an offsite, let's do strengths, and let's all get energized. This is absolutely about, how do we build this into the process so that it actually becomes part of the way you do things. All of a sudden, this is now, it takes a life of its own. It's no longer just a once-off event. And then you have regular check-ins and regular pulse checks using Q12 throughout the life of the project. And this way we can actually measure the progress of our intervention. Our numbers, people are always a little skeptical when it comes to doing people interventions, because it's so hard to measure typically. What's the return on investment of this intervention program? But now we can actually start to link it back to the hard project metrics. So the project is still going to be judged in terms of, has it arrived on time, on budget? So your typical project metrics are there. So we can link and show how, if you don't focus on the people, and we know from experience, and research is starting to support this, that if you don't focus on the people, you will come back and you will actually start to spend double that in trying to fix the project. And that led me to the second type of project, which is, well, what happens if we have in-flight projects that are large and complex, and these projects are slightly off the rails? How do we actually bring them back onto a road to success? So the second focus area was around large, complex projects that are in flight, but they're in trouble and they need intervention. And this is, once again, we can apply Q12, we can apply strengths, we can apply coaching, we can apply pulse checks, and we can bring them back on track.
Very interesting. I like the visual that you've given of the triangle with the people, the process, and the technology. So when we're looking at these large projects, we have that triangle with those three touch points. At what point, when you are bringing your focus in on the people, does that start to influence the processes? So, do you actually end up switching people from one task to another based on what they lead with as far as their dominant themes, that sort of thing?
Right. Well, as we've known from the Gallup training, you have skills, knowledge, and talents. And talents being the X factor, and talents being the multiplier that you can actually then use to apply to develop into areas of strengths. So the skills and knowledge, we still have to hire people who can do the job. So the actual skills required to be an analyst or an architect or a developer is still required. Where the strengths overlay comes in is it starts to help us understand how people are going to operate. So if you think of your typical project managers, if all that we needed on the process level was to send them on a training course, teach them the mechanics of project management, follow the steps, follow the methodology, then all projects should be delivered perfectly and exactly the same and in a predictable way. But we know that project managers, you have two project managers, they go about things fundamentally differently. So you might have one project manager who's more relationship-based, and they have excellent stakeholder skills and excellent stakeholder management. And for them, it's all about how do we make sure that the project teams and the customers and our stakeholders are fully engaged in the process. Whereas another project manager is far more task-orientated, and their execution is second to none. So strong on the discipline, focus, analytical, and they will follow the process like nobody else. So which is the better project manager? Well, the answer is, well, it depends on the type of project as well that you're doing. And the one thing that we've seen is if you have a project that is unstructured, blue sky, we don't quite know where we're heading, perhaps somebody who's got strong adaptability skills might be really, really useful, and strategic thinking. Whereas if you have a regulatory reform program that has to follow the rules, it's going to be audited, you have to go back to the financial regulators around what you're doing, it's absolutely important that you follow the process, you stick to the rules, and you tick the boxes. And for that, you need a type of project manager who's going to be enthused and energized by process. And this is where it's about how do we get the best out of individuals by, one, understanding the nature of the role, and then second of all, how they're going to operate once they're actually in that particular role. And this then starts to remove a lot of the friction and the tension between when a manager expects you to operate in a certain way because they may be predisposed in a certain way. And all of a sudden it's now, I'm not expecting everybody to be the same. I'm not expecting all the project managers to be the same. I now know that they're going to be different. And how do we now get the best out of those project managers?
Mm-hmm. And what about the technology side? How would it impact that?
So the technology is probably it has a smaller overlap with the human dimension. Only that if you're ordering in hardware and kit and network equipment, that's the easy part really. The equipment you just plug and play, connect it up, and it's typically on its way to working the way it should. And if it doesn't work, you just unplug it and buy another one, put another one in. Whereas with people, it's a little harder to just plug them in and unplug them. Obviously, there's the human, the HR processes, and there's legislation. You can't. We're not like The Apprentice in America. That show where you say you're fired. In Australia, our labor laws are a little different. So we want to make sure that we've got the right person on the right role at the right time, and we're playing to their strengths. So that sort of closes off that whole triangle for us. But we've typically focused heavily on the bottom two, which is what equipment do I need? What technology are we purchasing? And then what process are we going to overlay that with? And we think that we can solve all the problems if we just got a tight enough process. But it actually, in many cases, people are still such an integral part of making sure that those processes are actually followed. And you can't just leave it to the process side if you're not focusing on the people. And this is where obviously strengths is very key.
Fantastic. Dion, you're probably one of the best in Australia at using the Q12 in your project management. Can you talk about how you've done that? Really, what the response is when you go back to the executives with the data that you have on the back of that? What's the reaction? How do you present it? What's the reaction?
Sure. I'll give you an example. We've just completed a 6-month project that actually fell into my niche target offering, which was a $10 million project. It was delivered between India and Australia. It was about 50 people all up who were involved. When we kicked this project off, we decided, well, we're going to do something different because this was the continuation of a failed previous very large project, and we had to do something different. And my approach to doing something different was, well, in the past, you didn't focus on the people. People were burnt out. People were taking stress leave. People were actually thinking of committing suicide because of the stress of the project. So the human cost of the previous incarnation was too high, so we had to do something different. So when we kicked off this phase of the project, I kicked off immediately with doing Q12. And that was to say, well, we need to get a snapshot of where the team is at. And the team in this context comprised both internal and externals, our technology teams, our business teams, and our external partners. We treat them all as one team because we're all working towards a common goal. and a common purpose. So that gave us the benchmark to start off with. Some very interesting insights came out of that. One of them was our initial hypothesis was that teams in Australia, working for the number one bank in Australia, living in one of the best cities of the world, would be far more engaged than our suppliers who are split between India and Australia, and those Indian teams who are based in Australia were living in shared accommodation far away from family. Well, it was actually the exact opposite. We found that the Indian teams were actually more engaged than our Australian teams. And as we started to, peel back the onion as to try and understand, well, what's driving this, we saw a number of really, really interesting insights. One of them was there was a lot of bad negative publicity in the media with regards to banking in Australia, and a lot of the internal teams. When it got to the question around the mission and purpose of my organization makes me feel my job is important, we were actually ranking in the bottom 10th percentile of global teams. People were not going to a barbecue and boasting about working at a particular bank. All of a sudden, there was almost a little bit of apprehension. And we never thought that would actually come out so strongly because we happened to be working for one of the largest banks, the most successful banks in the world. But one of the interesting other parts around our Indian counterparts was very engaged, but yet on the basics, the question number 2, which talks about, do I have the materials to do my job? They were languishing in the bottom 8th percentile of global teams. And that then led us to have a conversation and to find out, well, what's actually going on in India? And what we realized was the bandwidth between India and Australia was not up to scratch. Things were taking 10, 15 minutes after they'd logged on to actually connect. And this then led us to then start to investigate, well, how can we do this better? What do we need to put in place? How do we need to increase bandwidth? How do we need to upgrade various pieces of technology to ensure that the teams that are offshore can actually function? Because they're engaged, they know what they need to do, they're committed to quality, and they want to do a great job. And yet we haven't given them the tools to do the job. The second interesting part around why I want to highlight India in particular is there's a great question in the Q12 which talks about, in the last 7 days, have you received praise or recognition? And some people might look at that and say, but that's a very short-term recognition. It's in the last 7 days. Until you start to overlay the generational view of your workforce. When I look at Australia, we have an aging population. And the last large project team that I led, the average age was actually over 40 in a technology team. Whereas when I spoke to my Indian counterparts in the technology teams, they actually have a millennial workforce, where the average age is 28. Now, you start to think about recognition for a millennial versus a Gen X or a boomer, you suddenly then realize that, well, for my millennials, they're getting instant feedback all the time. They're posting on Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat. If somebody likes it, you know about it. And if somebody doesn't like it, you know about it instantly. And yet the management structures at some of our companies that have got a large millennial workforce are actually not taking heed of that. And they're actually not, they're still adopting a once a year feedback structure. So they're actually losing the hearts and the minds of the very people who are delivering the work for them. So that was another really, really key call out, where we could actually say, here's something that we can do, which is very simple, which is to start, recognizing people on a more short-term basis. And there's various technologies that we could use as well for that in terms of recognition.
And when you're giving that sort of feedback to the executives, how's it being received? Are they saying, absolutely, we'll act on that right now? I mean, what is their response? Are they saying, yes, actually, we this is our experience as well, and now that we have some data to back it, we'll actually execute on that?
Yeah, absolutely. To give you an example, at this particular bank that I'm working, there's actually a mandate that if we are going to use one of our outsourced partners, that the outsource partner needs to have 70 to 80% of their workforce based offshore in India so that we can get the right price point. Now, there's a mandate that says move all of the work to India, and then we don't have the basics in place for them to actually do the work when they are based in India. So when I shared this back with the management at the bank, they then said, well, this is actually gold, because for the first time we have some data that can actually shape what we need to do to make sure that we are set up for success.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing now is that actually then led us to say, well, maybe we need to actually embed some of the bank's team in India working with their counterparts in India so that they can remove roadblocks back in Australia. So this is actually starting to shape the way that we're actually setting up for success on a much larger scale. By something as simple as using Q12 and answering the one question that says, do you have the resources and materials to do your job?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, we know that Q12 is powerful, but to be honest with you, the picture that you're painting shows, I think, beautifully the importance of Q12 working together with strengths, because there is, without Q12, something's missing, right? You don't have that framework, that data, that ability to right? And so I think not all of our coaches understand the importance of Q12. I think it's a tool that can't be underestimated. Do you use it just the quantitative data, or do you, on the back of your Q12, do you guys have some focus groups, some discussions? Do you go into the qualitative side as well?
Oh, absolutely. The raw data is just a number. And that number, we do have some relativity when you compare it to global teams, but it's the catalyst for the conversation. And the power is not in the number. The power is not in spending 5 minutes in answering a couple of questions. It's where that leads to, which is the conversation around, and now what? What are we going to do about it? For so many engagement surveys at many large companies, there's a fair amount of cynicism because the companies ask the questions, get the data, and then don't necessarily do something about it. What we try to do differently over here was to say, we're going to get the data. We're not going to try and boil the ocean. We are going to focus on those one or two items where we think we're going to get the greatest benefit. We're then going to talk to the teams. We're going to find out, what are they experiencing on the shop floor? Where is the pain? Have we got it right? Because the data is the data, but if you're not having the conversation, you don't necessarily know the why, and you don't necessarily always know which angle to take that if you made a small change could make a massive difference. For example, the data doesn't tell me that I need to put a bank employee in India. It just tells me materials and equipment, you scored low. Now, without that follow-on, you're actually missing a very, very great opportunity to then say, well, this is telling me, it's taking the temperature, it's telling me there's a problem. Now we've got to go and figure out what do we need to do. But it's not just about the problems, it's also about, let's highlight where there is good, where is the best practice happening in our teams, because we want to learn from the teams that are getting it right. So if I have a team where they're saying, you know what, I know what's expected of me at work and the recognition is great, I want to go and talk to those teams and find out, well, what are you doing? Because you're obviously doing something right. We need to be able to replicate that. So the temptation is often in Q12 to look at those low points and to forget about the high points. But I think if you take a leaf out of the appreciative inquiry theory, it's around, let's focus on what's right with a team as opposed to what's wrong with a team. And that plays very, very well in terms of the whole strengths philosophy as well.
Yeah, interesting. It's got some great stuff, Dion. One of the other things I like, you've mentioned, you're talking about the millennials, right? And there's a lot of data that we've put out and reports that I know you've accessed that we've put out about the what does the millennial generation look like? How do they need to be managed and developed? And now we have another one that's just come out on women in the workplace. Those resources that are easily accessible, I think for our coaches, that's a good starting point as well. If they're really trying to get a great snapshot of what we've learned, what Gallup has learned about how to best manage and develop those groups, and that's something that you clearly have taken advantage of, and I think have used that really well. So yeah,
absolutely. I mean, if I can just add to that, for me, it's all around having credible resources that you can actually reference when you're speaking, especially to corporates. They want to know, we like you, the individual, we're listening to you, the individual, and we have faith in you, the individual, but what's backing it up? And this is where I've taken some borrowed credibility from the likes of Gallup from the likes of Accenture, who use obviously strengths, from the partnership between McKinsey's and Gallup in terms of the Organizational Sciences Institute. Therein lies great power for coaches when you can actually reference where else it's being used. And have it readily at your fingertips. And that's when I think the Millennial Report, the Women in the Workforce, those are, tremendous tremendous insights that we can actually then start to apply when you're looking at a team, and you're looking at Q12, when you're looking at strengths. The 2016 meta-analysis is one of the other ones that I use all the time, because when you're speaking to financial people, they want numbers, they want the hard data, they want to know, why must I do this? And what's different between this and SurveyMonkey, for example? And then you can start to point to all the research that's been done and which other large organizations are using it in their environment. So all of a sudden, it's much larger than the actual survey itself. So the whole is greater than the sum of the individual questions. And this is where, it's just been tremendous to have those examples where we've got some, really thought leader organizations, whether it be Accenture, whether it be Facebook, whether it be Rackspace, McKinsey's. Those are just tremendous assets that we can actually draw from.
As we talk about this new sort of direction that you have for these large projects, I think another interesting point about that is we know that strengths is successful when the client and the organization and the coach are able to clearly articulate the why. Why are we doing this? What are we pointing this towards? By the very nature of a project, the goal has been articulated, right? We have something very
Correct.
specific that we're pointing this towards. I think what happens too often with strengths is people are interested in it, and they there's a bit of a emotional attachment that they have, or it resonates for them, but it's never really taken that next step to say, why are we doing this? While self-awareness is interesting, it's often not enough for an organization to invest a lot of man hours and a lot of money behind it in order to explore it. So by the very nature of what you're doing, you're bypassing that pitfall and saying, in working with a project, we are going to have a very clearly articulated why, which is a very big step towards success.
Absolutely. If you think of, and I don't know how many of you have watched the TED Talk by Simon Sinek, where he talks about the golden circles, and he speaks exactly to that, where he talks about, in the center, it's the why, and you've got to go from the inside out. And the why are we doing what we're doing? Then you move to the next one, which is the how we're doing it, and then the what we're doing. And when you take it from the outside in, you actually miss the purpose of why you're doing something. And we're not doing strengths because we want to make people feel good. We're not doing strengths because we want to pass the time. This is not just another team build activity. So this year we're going to do strengths, and it'll be a half-day session, and then thank you for coming. We then go back to our workplace and we forget about it until next year. All right, we've done strengths last year. Let's do something else this year. This is about actually making it part of your operating rhythm. It's about actually embedding it into the conversations. It's the one-on-one conversations. That's where the power comes in. So you just think of the benefit that a manager has when the manager understands the top 5 of their individual team members. All of a sudden, I'm not trying to second guess. I'm not guessing what your talents are, and my expectations of you are then no longer, why can't you be more like Mary? Now it's about, how can you be more of you? And this is, and I had an example of this where a new manager started recently, and I was actually just doing some interim management, and while they were hiring somebody, and I did strengths with all the team members, and then in my handover notes to him, I said to him, well, this is your team, and these are their strengths. And then we got him to do his strengths, and then he could overlay that and see, well, you know what, in some cases, he is diametrically opposite to some of the people in his team, but now he knows that on day 1 of this new manager starting. So now he can start to intentionally say, right, these people are the analytics in the team. These people are the relationship builders. These people are the guys who are going to get stuff done. And then he can start to then shape how he allocates work, how he allocates projects. It's no longer a guessing game. There's actually some fact behind it.
Dion, with all of your experience in corporate life, what do you find is the best way to integrate strengths with competencies? I mean, when you go into a client and they have a very rigid competency framework, how do you use strengths with that?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the competency framework, I mean, that clearly is specifying, it's speaking to the skills and knowledge that's required for the role. So there's actually a model that I've recently been sort of working on that actually speaks to that, where if you think the end goal is, what is the goal? And if you just think of that as we're all heading towards something, and the input into that is the job and the job spec, and the job spec is telling us, well, these are the competencies required, these are the skills, this is the knowledge that's required in order for you to do your job. So that's actually the input in terms of the sort of minimum standards for that particular role. But then you can start to overlay, two additional things. The one is if you think of it from the top, the 3 E's. The 3 E model is around, education, experience, and exposure. And that's how, you actually develop on the job. Some things you do formal education, some things you get experience, and some you just get exposed to new things. But supporting all of that is your top 5. And this is when you start to move through, your own self-awareness and then development of your strengths and then your ability to apply it. And if you go through a typical name, claim, and aim, this is where it's all pointing towards performance. At the end of the day, it's what do we want to achieve? What is the goal? What's the inherent requirements of the role? So what are the competencies required? What's the skill and the knowledge that I need to do my job? How am I going to further develop that? Am I going to do a course? Am I going to go on some training? Do I just need to be exposed to things? Am I going to go and work on the job? And then your talents are the ones that tell you how you're going to do that in terms of the nature that you're going to do your job. If you're a learner and intellectual, well, guess what? You're going to be taking the books and you're going to be diving in and you're going to be researching yourself, whereas other people are more experiential based, and they're going to need to actually do it. So that's going to, when you understand that, you can then start to overlay how your strengths can help you in your work and build that into your development plans.
Excellent. Do you have any other resources that you would recommend coaches have a look at to tie together with strengths or processes, internal, external, anything that you've come across that you think really beautifully fits with strengths?
I think if people are not using Q12, obviously it's a logical companion to strengths. But I think to the point that we were talking about earlier about getting data and getting metrics, that's such an important part in terms of the conversation, especially in dealing with larger corporates. They want to know what's the return on investment, and having a mechanism by which you can actually measure before the intervention and after the intervention, and then continuously measure. That becomes a very, very powerful. So there are a number of obviously assessment tools, and Q12 I like for a number of reasons. There's some interesting ones that I know NASA have developed something which is very interesting. I think it's the 4D model. I don't know if you've come across that. I had a look at it. I actually preferred Gallup's one. It was a little simpler, as you can appreciate. Our NASA friends would come up with something that works very well, but it's a little bit more complex. But there are a number of other assessment tools, and without wanting to try and give a full list of them, people will come across many different ones. But I think having a tool where you can actually measure and take a baseline, and then come back after an agreed period of time, and then remeasure, and then actually start to show who've actually improved. And one of the other ways that I'm thinking of is even to where an organization uses a measure which is, I suppose, quite widely used because it's simple, is the Net Promoter Score, for example. Now, I know that there's been a lot of articles around, its validity and all of that, but if we just put that aside, if an organization is using NPS, then I continue to say, well, take the NPS of your control group that doesn't have any strengths intervention, and take the NPS of the group where we're going to start doing some work, do that at the beginning, and then after we've done the strengths intervention, we can come back and remeasure NPS, and that way you're using the organization's own tools to validate the benefit of strengths.
Yeah.
So it's sometimes you don't even have to introduce a new tool. You just say, well, what's the organization already using? And then how do we actually then retrofit that and use that to actually justify the benefit that we've gained through strengths.
Yeah, excellent. What about your favorite Dion resource? I mean, you have put so many into the community, different photo collages and those sorts of things. Can you just talk about a few of them, maybe where the ideas came from and what's really your favorite? Because I'd love for people to be able to go search for those resources after they hear you.
Sure, absolutely. It all started where we were sitting on the couch as a family, and I said to my kids and my wife, I said, what car do you think of when you think of a particular strength? And that's where it all started. And I said, well, what do you think of when you think of achiever or competition? And those ones were easy. And they said, oh, a Ferrari, a racing car, and so on. And then we had a bit of fun, and we said, well, could we extend this? Could we even imagine doing it for all 34? And we said, well, what about responsibility? And we thought, well, maybe a fire engine, or, what about empathy? And then we thought about an ambulance. And so we went on. And eventually it became quite addictive. And then I started spending all my nights trying to find images of different themes. And it's actually been, it's been great fun on the one hand, and it's actually brought strengths to life in a large way by having different themes. So that then led me to, it started with motor cars. And in fact, I even had a coach in India who was doing a coaching session with a group of executives from a motor car company. And I made them available to him, and he used them in the session in India with these car executives. And of course, it was relevant. The images, all of a sudden, it wasn't just words on the page. It brought life, and that was something which was just tremendous for them. But subsequent to that, I've created various series using animals and dogs and wild animals. I've done some for the military and medical, and then I had some fun with doing an Australian version using Aboriginal art to actually create one that was culturally relevant to a non-Western community. So there's all different ways that one can, and I've seen some people in the web have also taken various Disney type characters, the minions and so on, and it becomes quite addictive. The first 20 are easy, and the last 7 or 8 are absolutely impossible to try and think of what image am I going to use to depict that. So that's really weird.
I used the dog one. I used that one with a workshop that I did with some school students, and they absolutely loved it. It just, put those up and say, which strength do you think this could be, or which theme would this be? It was brilliant.
Right. That's great. Fantastic. My favorite has to be historical figures, the famous faces one, the Strengths Hall of Fame that I put together. In fact, it was my wife who said to me, what about if you did something with historical figures? And I said, there's no ways I'm going to get 34 historical figures to depict each of the strengths. But so eventually we chose that. And obviously some of the pictures, some people might think, why'd you choose that particular one and why we've chosen a different one? And that's the whole purpose of it. It's to get you to think about strengths. And if you don't like the picture, then which one would you put in there? And then that for me is actually mission accomplished when people don't just accept the picture, but they actually start to think about the meaning behind the picture. So that's where it started. Who knows where it'll lead, and which others will still eventuate. But it's been a tremendous journey.
Fantastic. Jim, do you have any questions from the chat room from anyone who has some?
We do. We'll have to answer them quickly because we're running short on time here. But I'll ask one. I think that if we go back to your in-flight, when in the very beginning you were talking about getting with teams that are already in flight, maybe struggling, having some problems. JB asked the question, how well are you able to change the course without labeling the project a failure? If you come in and you start doing these kinds of things and you have to make some big changes, how do you go about that without labeling the project as a failure?
So for me, it's absolutely around, how do we, the intervention has got to be not that you're bad, it's going to be, we're here to help. Because when a project's off the rails, everybody knows it's off the rails. It's not like, oh, surprise, newsflash, project is off the rails. So when you know that a project is struggling, bring in an independent party like a strengths coach, it's not threatening. And the thing I love about using strengths is that we're not trying to highlight the weaknesses of individuals. We're actually trying to highlight those areas of strength that we can then apply. Obviously, Q12 will highlight where we need to focus, but we can still use appreciative inquiry approach, which says, it's not all that bad. You're not at zero. In some cases, you might have some teams that might be, at very, very low levels compared to their global counterparts. But I think it's all around the positioning. And if you take a positive lens to that, which is all about, we want to actually make this the greatest project. And a great exercise to do is to ask people, well, what's the best project that you've ever worked on? And what made it so fantastic? And then to have that on the flip chart and to say, well, that's what we need to create here. Because surely everybody wants to work on a great project.
So you mentioned the strengths coach. In your experience, besides that, having a coach involved, are there other gaps in skill sets when we're thinking about strengths that need to be introduced into the team?
I think it's about not being biased. So it's about first understanding before you jump to conclusions. And that to me would be one of the key things where I actually did an exercise 2 weeks ago with the CIO and his leadership team, and the exercise that I started with was using strengths to combat bias. And I said, we all have worked with different nationalities, and I said, well, how about answering the following question? Americans are always, ... choose from the 34 strengths, and let's create the ideal American profile from the 34 strengths. And that is to highlight we all have biases when we think of particular population groups. Yet when you look at the data shows very little difference at the broad level between, say, Americans and Indians. But there's obviously the individual fingerprint in terms of your top 5 and how unique that makes you. So, don't assume, get the facts.
And so how are Americans? No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. And then, so let me see if I thought I had one more question here. I don't. Actually, we're running right up against the hour, Ann. So any final thoughts?
No, look, thanks, Dion. I think that was great stuff for our listeners. Thank you very much for that. And again, we do appreciate your generosity of sharing resources as you always do. So thanks for joining us again.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Dion, I will ask this one question because this gets asked a lot just before we go. Budget-wise, when you go into these organizations, coaches ask all the time, how do you pitch this from a budget perspective? What's your technique to go in there to prove the value right off the bat and be able to, loosen some of those budget dollars?
Absolutely. So in the past, the challenge was always if you see it as a nice to have, then obviously you're up against dollars. So if this is seen as discretionary spend, then it's obviously a lot harder. Where my new focus is this is absolutely mandatory spend. This is like insurance to set up your project for success. And the way to price that is I'm just actually linking it and saying, well, if you're not spending a quarter or 0.5% of your project's value on focusing on the people, you're actually not doing yourself a service. So that takes it away from being, this is a nice to have workshop. This is actually an integral part of setting us up for success.
So you say 0.5% of the project value. I mean, I know you're just throwing that out, but that's Correct. A great way of going about what's this project valued at? 0.5 percentage point of that. Are you at least investing 0.5%? And you're finding success with that, I take it.
I am indeed, yes.
Awesome. All right. Well, Dion, great to have you on again. For folks who are Called to Coach groupies and have been around Called to Coach a long time, we had Dion on way back January of 2015, and so you can head back there if you want to see that. If you want to see that interview as well, Dion, great to have you on. And I know you've got lots of great materials. Folks can find a lot of those materials in our Facebook group if you go to facebook.com/groups/Called to Coach. A lot of those materials, and you're very generous with those. So thanks, Dion, for doing that as well.
You're welcome.
We'll remind everyone to take full advantage of all the resources we have available at the Gallup Strengths Center, just gallupstrengthscenter.com. Send us your questions or comments. If you'd like to be a guest blogger on our coaches blog, you can send those submissions to us as well. coaching@gallup.com. You can also catch the recorded audio and video of this program as well as all the past ones, including the links to our Facebook group, the one I just mentioned there, in case you want the link to that. You couldn't write it down fast enough. That link, the YouTube page, iTunes, RSS feeds, iPhone and Android apps, everything we have available to you is on our coaches blog. Just go to coaching.gallup.com. If you're interested in becoming a Gallup-Certified Strengths Coach, you can see a complete list of all our courses that are available, including those and anything coming up in Sydney there that we want to highlight real quick before we go.
Last week of November, into the first week of December is our last one here. And then we've got one in Singapore, November 21st to 25th.
Awesome. If you want to get exact details or those dates have passed, and that's very possible, head out to courses.gallup.com to get a complete list of everything that is available out there as well. Don't forget, Dion mentioned the summit, and the summit for 2017 is coming up quickly. And if you haven't registered yet, you can register right now. Go to CliftonStrengthsSummit.com and all the information is available. Early bird pricing is in effect until October 31st of 2016. Everybody gets the least expensive price you'll ever get until October 31st. So if you're thinking about doing it, now would be a great time to head out there. CliftonStrengthsSummit.com. If you found this helpful, we ask that you share it. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We'll look forward to the next Call to Coach. And with that, we'll say goodbye, everybody.